time. That is until I heard a famous Italian opera singer who sang the opera. He was the lead in the opera. I'm not a fan of opera necessarily, but anyway, he sang the lead in the opera, after which he heard the audience shouting in Italian, "Ancora, ancora." Well, you know what that means, encore. So he answers the curtain call, comes out, sings the finale a second time. Well, this happened not once, not twice, but 7 times. The last time when he came out, he sang and gestured to the crowd as if to say, "I've given you all that my lungs can give you," and someone sitting on the second row, no one's on the second row said, "This time get it right." So I understand why I like it. Asked to come back a second time, so maybe we can get right this time when we didn't get right the first time. Well, this business about being a Baptist is that it is most intriguing and most fascinating. Not just because I am one, because frankly, I did not grow up one. I did not grow up in the church at all until I was about 11 years old. On my mother's side of the family, there were no Christians. On my father's side of the family, there was one Christian, my grandmother. I always knew there was something special about her, even before I knew why it was. She lived with my crotchety old grandfather, and I do mean he was crotchety, but she had this aura about her. She had this spirit of energy and life, and was always singing songs I'd never heard before until I started going to church, and it turns out she was singing and humming church songs. Turns out she was the only Christian in our family, and she was Baptist. So some years into my growing up, about my 11th year, my mother decided that she needed more help raising my younger brother, not me of course, yes, me too, raising us than she had the capabilities to do by herself. My father was traveling right much at the time in the military. And so we started going to the little Baptist church down the street, not too far from where we had moved. And the rest, as they say, is history, not Baptist history, my history, how I became Baptist. Well, I'm not here to talk about my story necessarily, but I am here to talk about this history of the Baptist movement. Contrary to public opinion, and is this: there were no Baptists in the first century that is associated with Jesus. Now, there is a verse in Matthew chapter 16, verses 16, 17, and 18, in which Jesus is having a conversation with Peter, of all people. And Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." You get it? "You're Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church." We only would have wished we had been there, to have heard Jesus say, and then to do something. To say, "You are Peter," let's suppose Josh is Peter. "You are Peter," and if Jesus were to say, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church," we would have known that Peter was the first pope. Because Jesus had what? Placed hands on him and said, "Upon this rock I'll build my church." But we weren't there, any more than we were there to hear Jesus and to watch Jesus gesture with his hands. "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church," and we would have known what? That's the cornerstone for what would have been, why not, First Baptist Church, Caesarea Philippi. Because that was precisely the place where Jesus was when he said what? "You are Peter, and upon this rock," as in to say where? At Caesarea Philippi, I'm going to build my church. But you weren't there to hear that. Any more than we were there to have heard him say, "You are Peter, and upon this rock," Jesus, speaking and gesturing to himself, would have said, "Upon this rock I'll build my church," and we would have known that Jesus was talking about what? "I am the foundation upon which the church will hereafter be found and established and built." Or maybe Jesus just said, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church," and he made no gesture to anything which would have rolled back and would have related to the things that he had just been talking about. That is, there's a certain kind of place, a certain kind of people, a certain kind of affirmation of faith which becomes the foundation of the church. But we weren't there to hear those things. For which reason, the world has known a lot about churches. In my driving, here tonight, this afternoon. I passed a whole lot of them. Lots of churches are by lots of different names. So let's take a moment to take a look at this thing called the Baptist movement. Noting, I think, as you will find intriguing to me, when you say Baptist, as someone once said, you've said a mouthful. Because there are as many different kinds of Baptists as there are Baptists. And this is what I mean. You get two Baptists together, there are going to be three opinions. Because often enough among Baptists, one of these Baptists can't what? Can't make up his or her mind about the particular subject in question. Did you know that we are that kind of people? We Baptists. In fact, in this group here tonight, I could probably stop and ask any one of you a different kind of theological question, and guess what? We probably are not going to provide the same answer. And Baptists have been okay with that for the most part. Now, there are certain churches which get started, guess what? Because you didn't agree with my particular opinion about this particular subject, and so what have Baptists done? They've left this church and gone down the road and what? Started another one. Yeah, we Baptists, we don't divide and conquer, we divide and, well, we divide and divide and divide. That has been the nature of what it has meant. I later learned to be a Baptist. So, one of us can't make up our mind, which also means that throughout our life story, there are going to be some things, undoubtedly, about which you're perhaps going to change your mind in terms of what you believe about any number of things. I know it surprises some of my students when I confess to them about this subject when I'm teaching it. I have changed my mind. I go, not you. Surely you have always believed this one thing about this particular subject. That isn't the case. We are not required, quote, as Baptists, to believe the same thing, number one. And number two, nor are we required to sign a statement whereby we say, these are the things that we believe, into the story. Baptists have never done that or said that. Now, there are some local Baptist churches that do that, but that's coming up in the later part of our conversation. So, we Baptists, just check out some of this information here that you might find of interest. In the 1980s, research done about Baptists revealed that there were 52 Baptist denominations, not only just churches, 52 Baptist denominations alone in North America, not to mention the 100 more that can be found across the globe. There are all kinds of Baptists. This church's affiliation is
duly aligned.
Duly aligned. What and what?
Southern Baptist and Cooperative Baptist.
Southern Baptist, Cooperative Baptist. That's two different denominational sounding things. But there are 52 of these in North America alone, all kinds of Baptists. I was a pastor for a number of years in Iowa, and the church I was serving there happened to have been a Southern Baptist church back in the 80s, early 90s. But there were more Garb Baptists, as they were called, General Association of Regular Baptists in Iowa than there were Southern Baptists. In fact, when people would meet me and learn that I was a Southern Baptist in Iowa, they instantly assumed two things. Either I was a Garb Baptist, a General Association of Regular Baptists, or I was a Black Baptist. Because when they heard Southern and Baptist, guess what they put together? Southern with African American, and assumed that I was a Black Baptist. I didn't fit either of the criteria for them, because if you were a Garb Baptist, it meant certain things about the ladies in particular. The ladies dressed certain ways, did not wear makeup, and always wore skirts or dresses to church. Never did they wear jeans. Fascinating, nor jewelry. Different kinds of Baptists. These are just Baptists in North America, and on I could go about that. In 2009, intriguingly, the BBC, British Broadcasting Network, as you know, did some work and reported that Baptists formed the 5th largest Christian church in the world. At the time they were doing this research, Baptist churches found in every country of the world, having some 40 million members worldwide. That's lots of people, isn't it? That make up Baptists, at least in the world, with British Baptists having their own representative of these. In 2019, you see the other additional note here, that Baptists in America numbered some 50 million people, with Southern Baptists claiming what? 14.8 million of them. Now, when you hear Cooperative Baptists, which is the Baptist affiliation, the dual alignment that this church has, they generally are included among the numbers of Southern Baptists, because most Cooperative Baptist churches, guess what? Sprung out of what previously had been exclusively Southern Baptist churches. More about that in a bit. And the more about that has to do with controversy. When you say Baptist and you've said a mouthful, you also should hear one other thing. When you say Baptist, you also should say controversy. Because Baptists have been controversy. Can you imagine that? Has there ever been a controversy in a Baptist church that you've been a part of? Okay. Has there ever been a moment when there wasn't a controversy going on at some level in the Baptist church? We are a fascinating and an intriguing group of people. Well, other statistics, of course, that you can see there, but let me push us on into the deeper history of Baptists specifically, that latter point here. In 2009, Baptists globally celebrated the 400th anniversary of our birth as Baptists, which obviously means Baptists actually reach back how far? To the year 1609. Some interesting things were happening in our own country around about that time, or, well, we weren't quite a country yet, but you know American history, don't you? Yeah. This country is beginning to be populated around about this time. When was the Jamestown? Okay, see there? So you're really close here in your history in terms of the Baptist movement beginning worldwide. Well, watch what happens here. We as Baptists actually have our greater theological origins with a particular group called Anabaptists. Isn't that an interesting word there? Anabaptists? Well, it literally means rebaptized. Rebaptized. Now, the point about this emphasis upon rebaptism is this. Prior to this particular movement of people known as Anabaptists, persons would be born into the Christian faith. Born into it. Whether as a Roman Catholic or some other branch of denomination, born into it. Shortly after one's birth, a child, an infant, would be baptized to become part of the church. There was a group of people, however, in the early 1500s who said, wait a minute, we have now finally been granted permission to read the Bible. Something happened, you see, in the year 1450 that changed everything in the world. A particular German man by the name of Gutenberg created something called movable type. And with the creation of movable type, the first book ever printed using movable type was, guess what? The Bible. From that day forward, persons were now being granted permission for the first time to own and to be able to read a Bible. I would venture to say probably in your own family story, if you reach back far enough in your family, even in America, the first, if not only book that you would have in your household would have, guess what, been a family Bible, in which the family tree would be spread out to show who was born to whom at what time and at what place. And many a mother in the home would be the educated person. While the father was busy doing the labor and the work, the mother caring for the family, the mother often, more often than the man, could read. And guess what she would do? She would teach the children how to read by candlelight, and it would have been the Bible. Fascinating in our story that this time frame of the invention of movable press, movable script at least, promoted the study and the reading of the Bible, which allowed people to begin reading the Bible for the first time in ways that they never had been allowed to do so prior to this time. So that in a couple of countries, in Germany and in Switzerland, there were groups of people who said, we now are reading the Bible ourselves for the first time, and we have discovered something. We have discovered that in our reading of the Bible for the first time for ourselves, that people who get baptized in the Bible, guess what? They are adults, and they are believers. Can you argue with that? Can you read anywhere else in the whole of the Scripture that it ever says that what? Someone who was not or had not become a believer is baptized? No. There is no evidence. And there's a lone suggestion that when the Philippian jailer was converted, if you might remember that story from Acts chapter 16, when the Philippian jailer was converted, we are told he was baptized and his household. So someone might suggest that his household being baptized could have meant what? Baptizing the babies. But that's kind of an argument from silence because we're never told that babies were baptized, only that his household was. But every other example in the Bible of anyone being baptized, it happens upon what? Their profession or their declaration that they believe, upon which they then become baptized by someone. So these persons called radical reformers in Germany and in Switzerland began to protest that even our great fathers of the faith, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Hildegard Zwingli, they began to protest that for all of the changes that they thought need to be made in the church, they had forgotten something very important: baptism of believers only. Not believing that they had gone far enough, these particular German persons in either Switzerland or in Germany, both speaking, of course, German, these names, Balthasar Hubmaier, Thomas Münster, Felix Manz, these people literally died. Literally died because they said, we believe a person must be a believer before he or she is baptized. I actually was in Zurich some years ago, about 1997, and while there I wanted to go to the spot where Felix Manz was killed. Now my guide on this particular trip that I was taking for the university, her name was Julia. She spoke beautiful English, multiple lingual lady, a very attractive, tall, thin, dark-complected woman, knew her history and beautifully. And she was talking about when we were crossing the Limmat River there. Have you ever been to Zurich? That's the river that bisects the city. And she was talking about this group of people back in Zurich's history, early 1500s, about the year 1527. In fact, January the 5th, 1527. And when she said that date, my ears instantly went on the alert. And she said there was a group of people in our city, a really difficult, really stubborn group of people, she said, in our city, who believed that a person could only become a member of the church if they were baptized and not as an infant. And so our city father, she said, took this particular man by the name of Felix Manz down to the river, put him on a boat, and pushed him out into the water there and said, Felix Manz, do you recant from this heretical viewpoint that you are here declaring? And his mother was standing there and his brother was standing there and said, do not recant, you have taught us the truth. And he refused to recant, so what they did was they put his hands behind his back and they tied his legs to his hands and they put a pole up between his back and legs, and guess what they did? They held him under the water until he began to bubble, and then they popped him up and said, do you recant, or do you want to be baptized again? They were playing with him. And he refused to recant, so they put him under the water again, and he bubbled a bit more, and they popped him back up, and they said, third and final chance. You either recant of this heresy of a believer having to be baptized only as a believer, or this time we will not raise you back up. And they plunged him under the water and baptized him to his death. Wow. That's in our Baptist story. He was an Anabaptist who believed this principle, so much so that he was unwilling to what? To recant from this viewpoint. So Julia's up there delivering this oration, and I raised my hand into the air. I said, "Oh, Julia," she said, "Yeah?" I said, "All of these people on the bus, myself included, Felix is our granddaddy." She said, "He was?" I said, "Yes, but that was a long, long time ago. And God is gracious and kind and merciful, and we forgive you." "Oh, I'm so glad," she said. Yeah, you see? Fascinating, isn't it? That in that part of the world, being baptized as a believer, which is what the Anabaptists were all about, would mean such a thing as that. That said, these Anabaptists, again, they are forerunners, and I'm going to show you how they are our forerunners. They are about 4 million of them right now in the world today. Most numerous of them are called Mennonites. Any Mennonites in our area? Have you known of Mennonites? I'm sure you have. Some of them are German Baptists, some of them are Amish. You've seen and perhaps watched television show about the Amish, right? Okay, the Amish people. And others are called Hutterites, and they number in this category. But all of them have as their foundational belief that a person must become a believer before he or she could be baptized, not be baptized as an infant first and later confirm one's faith. That simply was the tradition around which and out of which Baptists have come, hence the name Baptist. So this word Anabaptist means being rebaptized, because these persons, a Hubmaier, a Munzer, a Felix Manz, they all were baptized as infants themselves first. But recognizing and realizing from their reading of the Scripture that that was not a correct understanding of the Christian faith, they became Baptists and hence were rebaptized. Anyone in this room rebaptized? Were you baptized as an infant first and then rebaptized, quote, later as an adult? Yeah, so you see, this is something that's familiar to many of us even to this day. Not my story, because I didn't grow up in the church, so I was not baptized as an infant, but others perhaps were. So that's part of our story. But we Baptists, at least here in America, have a more immediate connection from the English or British Baptists. And here are a couple of names that you might recognize for an obvious reason. A John Smith and a Thomas Helwys. These are the two names. There is actually a publishing company in America today called Smith and Helwys Publishing. They actually published my book back in 2017.
We use their Sunday school curriculum.
And you use a Sunday school curriculum. Well, guess where these two fascinating names come from? They come from England. So here is John Smith and Thomas Helwys, who moved to Holland in the year 1607. Now start checking out these dates. 1607. King James becomes the King of England in 1603. Now, this is the same King James who was responsible for a particular edition of the Bible that most in this room probably have heard about and maybe grew up reading all the way. The King James Bible. Little do we realize that King James had no love lost for the Baptists, because there were a group of Baptists in England, his own England, connected with the likes of a John Smith and a Thomas Helwys, who came to three convictional conclusions, and here they are. That the Bible, not church tradition or religious creed, is the guide in all matters of faith and practice. Number two, the church should be made up of believers only. Now understand what they mean by that. One should be a believer before what? Becoming a member of the church. Believer first, not what? Member of the church now and maybe become a believer later. Foundational conviction. Not born into a local parish. The church, moreover, this group, Smith said, should be governed by those believers, not by hierarchical figures like bishops. Because they're in England, guess what? You've seen the film Robin Hood and other things, perhaps, haven't you? And you've seen how the church gets involved in politics and other such things. Well, these gentlemen said, no, this defies the biblical tradition, and we don't what? We don't want a merging of the state. We don't want the state meddling in religious matters. And so committed were they to this particular viewpoint that they ended up having to leave England, their own hometown, because they were banished under King James. And they left, and guess where they went? They went to Holland, Amsterdam. And in the year 1609, began the first known Baptist church in the world. This particular movement that originated out of this particular time frame associated with Smith and Helwich has a fascinating backstory, because Smith, having read the Bible, came to conclude, and he had been a Puritan minister prior to this, he came to conclude that a person should be a believer, become a believer, and then be baptized. So what does he do? He baptizes himself. Isn't that interesting? He says, I have come to conclude this to be the truth. No one else around me concludes this, so he immerses himself and says, I am a believer, now baptized. Shortly thereafter, he finds Thomas Helwich and persuades him to his particular opinion. And in so doing, then he what? He baptizes Helwich. They go off to Holland. They encounter a group of Mennonites while in Holland. And lo and behold, here was a group of people who what? They were baptizing believers themselves. And they said, wow, we finally found what? People who believe like we believe. Smith then had something of a spiritual crisis. He said, nowhere in the Bible have I ever read where a person baptizes himself or herself. Maybe I was wrong to what? Baptize myself. So what does he do? He turns to Thomas Helwich and says, hey man, I know I baptized you. Why don't you what? Why don't you baptize me so that our theology, my theology, is legitimate and is what it's supposed to be? Having done so, not too long afterwards, they return to England and are willing to take whatever grief they might receive from the local authorities there about their particular religious viewpoints. They return there and establish a Baptist church there in England, Gainsborough, England. They stay there for a while, and of course they're giving birth to children and other people, and the timing becomes intriguing because people then start fleeing England. And where do they come? On the principles of religious freedom. They come to America. They come here because they believe they can what? They can begin to experience religion without the state telling them what they can and cannot, must and must not do in order to be Christians. They begin coming to America. Interesting things are happening, of course, with these Baptists in England even prior to the groups coming to America, because the Baptists in England develop along two streams of theological thought. You knew theology would come into this, not just in terms of baptism and when a person should be baptized or not. But they fell into two particular categories called general or particular Baptist. You hear those words? General Baptist, particular Baptist. This all has to do with theology. Have any of you ever heard the word Calvinist? Calvinist, okay, good. Well, Calvinists fall into the category of the particular Baptists. Calvinists do. The Armenians, you ever heard the word Armenian? Maybe you've heard it a bit, maybe not. The Armenians tend to fall into the category of general Baptists. And these words, general in particular, are not complicated. It all comes down to the cross. Jesus died on the cross. And for whom it is that Jesus dies on the cross. So you're ready to do a little theology. I know it's a bit late. I know it's a Sunday night. I know you're getting a little groggy. It's kind of warm in here. Are you ready? A little theology. So here's the question. When Jesus died on the cross, did he die generally for the entire world? You ready to vote? Did he die generally for the entire world, or when Jesus died on the cross, did he die particularly and specifically only for those people who become Christians? That was the question. Big theological question. Did he die generally for everybody? And there were some Baptists who said, guess what? When Jesus died on the cross, he died for what? For who? Everybody. To which the particular Baptist said, well, if he did, if Jesus died for everybody, that must mean that everybody is going to be saved. Ooh. If he died for everybody, hello, then what? Everybody means everybody. And if he died for everybody, that means everybody has been died for. The other said, well, if he died and some people are not what? Going to be saved, that must mean his dying is for what? Particularly for those people who what? Who will believe. So now you have these two grand streams of theological thought. And you've had this conversation before in Sunday school, or you've had it in the dorm room, or you've had it in Sunday. You've had this conversation, and it isn't going away. In fact, it will circle back around in Southern Baptist life, if I can get us there before our time concludes tonight. It will circle back around. But as early as this particular time in British Baptist history, you had these two competing groups. Well, guess what? These Baptists end up coming to America, and they're bringing with them their what? Their respective views about Jesus having died for some, or having died for all. Right? So they land here. But that doesn't mean that Baptists have abandoned or have left Great Britain entirely, because there have been some famous preachers that have come out of there. Some of you have heard the name Charles Haddon Spurgeon, one of the great Baptist preachers, preached to thousands along with Alexander MacLaren in London in the day. Well, now we're ready to get to America. Good to get to America now. Okay. Any questions about what I said so far? Just interrupt me, flag me, say put it back up and say that again, or whatever. So let's get to America now. So here we get to America. As I have said to begin our conversation, Baptists have historically been associated with controversy. So, in the year 1638, a former Puritan minister came to conclude, baptism by immersion, baptism of believers, is in fact the best biblical understanding of what baptism is and who should be baptized. And of all places, he lives in where? Providence, Rhode Island. Because he has been run out of the Plymouth colony where he had originally landed. Remember Plymouth Rock, where he was at, 1620? In the year 1620. So he's living in the Plymouth colony, but his particular theological viewpoint does not jive consistently with the colony. So they drive him out, and he comes to Providence, Rhode Island. And while he's there, he is preaching and teaching these viewpoints of his own. And in the year 1638, founded the first Baptist church in America, the first Baptist church at Providence, Rhode Island. By the way, that church is still there today. Church of Roger Williams. Just an intriguing footnote or side note. Do you realize that Harvard College, that is now it's Harvard University, Harvard College's first president was named Henry Dunster, who, while he was serving as president of Harvard, converted to becoming a Baptist. Oh dear. Harvard, you might not have known, was originally founded to train preachers, to teach them Hebrew and Latin and Greek, to teach them how to be the best scholars and thinkers in town. You might even find it surprising to learn. Have you ever heard the minister or the preacher referred to as the parson? The parson? The parson lives in a parsonage, right? A parsonage. Do you know where that word came from? Well, I'm glad you asked. It came from a very interesting place. It came from the British Isles because the parson in town was the person, but they don't say person, they say parson. The parson. The parson. The best representative of the person in town was, guess who? The minister. He was the most trained. He was the most caring. He was the most loving. Every mother wanted her son to be a, guess what? And it was sons then, sorry. Wanted her son to be a what? To be a minister. Not a doctor, for heaven's sake. Not a lawyer, for heaven's sake. But a what? My son decided to be a lawyer. But what? Be a minister. That's what everybody wanted because he was the person that everyone looked up to. Well, Dunster and Harvard College, first college established in America, was to train ministers. He converted to becoming a Baptist, however, over his right reading of the Scripture and conclusion that a person should be what? Should be baptized as a believer and not in infancy, and ended up losing his position at Harvard. He resigned his position because the faculty who served alongside him disagreed with his theological position. He ends up losing his job out of his commitment to being a Baptist and his unwillingness to baptize his infant son when his son was born. Interesting. Just a footnote. Well, Roger Williams and John Clark, second person enters the story here, were originators of the Baptist faith in North America. They separated. I told you they had an argument. Baptists have always argued. So Clark was a part of the what? The original church at Providence. They separated, and he moves to Newport, Rhode Island. And in 1644, establishes the Second Baptist Church in America. Later in history, however, in 1847, the pastor of the Newport church said, I was really his first. Each one wanted to what? Take the credit of theirs being the first church, Baptist church in America. Okay, print gets a little smaller, sorry about that. If you're really interested in more of this backstory, Robert Baker did an article in 1979 which really summarizes the history of Southern Baptists. Southern Baptists. Because the Baptists that I've been here before describing are where in America? Up in the Northeast. We're in Rhode Island again. So how in the world did the Baptists get from what? Rhode Island all the way down here to North Carolina, South Carolina, and other places? Well, watch this. The first Baptist church in the South was Charleston, South Carolina. One of those ministers associated with the church in Providence, Rhode Island, actually left Rhode Island and went to Kittery, Maine. And from Kittery, Maine, traveled south, this man named William Screven, in 1682, established the First Baptist Church in the South. First Baptist Church, Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina. You get it? First Baptist Church, Charleston, South Carolina. Now, that isn't the first church in North Carolina. That's South Carolina. But it's just fascinating to me, at least, that these persons from where? The Northeast have had this kind of influence on whom? People in the South. Charleston, South Carolina. There's a Baptist church, however, that starts in North Carolina in 1727 through the ministry of a particular man named Paul Palmer in Shiloh, North Carolina, in Camden County. So that's the First Baptist Church in North Carolina. So here you have these churches in North Carolina and in South Carolina, but we haven't really gotten into yet where I want to go now with you for a few minutes. And that is, in North Carolina, Southern Baptists can trace their roots to two particular streams in the South. They're called Southern Baptists, right? Southern Baptists, because in the South. We'll talk about what happens that actually produces the Southern Baptist Convention in a moment. But en route to getting there, pay attention to these dates and what's happening in these places. So there's a place called Sandy Creek, North Carolina, and there's a place called Charleston, South Carolina. These two churches, these two areas, where the theology becomes very, very interesting. The Baptists in Charleston, South Carolina were particular Baptists. Particular Baptists. What do you say those are? The particular Baptists say that Jesus died for whom? Only those who will be saved. Guess what that meant? When you go back and look at the liturgy, that is the order of worship that they followed in that particular church, there's one thing that you most likely do in this church, as is in the case of most Baptist churches in this area. At the end of the worship service, prior to the benediction, there's something else that happens. And it's called a hymn of invitation. You don't say. A hymn of invitation. That is, persons are being what? Invited to do what? Come forward and profess whatever it is the Lord, quote, has laid on their hearts, to use that kind of language, correct? Well, guess what? In the Charleston church, they didn't have an invitation. Why need you have an invitation if those matters about what? God having died through Jesus' death on the cross for you has already been settled anyway. You don't need an invitation. Interesting. However, alongside this stream, out of the Sandy Creek, out of the Charlestonian world, comes Sandy Creek. Well, you can almost hear the name. It's Charleston. Sandy Creek. Well, look, these Sandy Creekers, when their preachers preached, they brought it. And it was loud, and it was clear, and hell was hot. Okay? You got the picture? Are you hearing it? Okay? I mean, that's how they preach. That's how they proclaim. And yet you're a Charlestonian bunch. Okay? Can you picture one preaching from a road and one preaching, okay, on the frontier? This is the picture. People often ask me, so what about you? Charleston or Sandy Creek? I said, well, I was raised in Sandy Creek, but I went to school in Charleston. And I say that with some seriousness, because the preaching that I heard as a boy, not having grown up in the church, was loud and long, and my preacher made it quite clear when he came to be the pastor of that church when I was only 12 or 13 years old, that we would not be out of church earlier than 1 o'clock. Never mind the fact that church started at 11 o'clock. We would not be out before 1 o'clock because the people at the First Baptist Church would be out at 12. And the Presbyterians would be out at 11:30. And the Methodists, sometimes there in between. But we weren't like them. We were the real church. We were the real believers. And we needed lots of loud and lots of long preaching. Got it? And then I went to school in Charleston and learned, well, wait a minute. So I'm just schizophrenic. I don't know. It depends on the day as to whether I'm a Sandy Creeker or a Charlestonian. But this is the backstory of who we are. And Southern Baptists actually came to be with the Sandy Creekers and the Charlestonian bunch getting together and saying, you know what? Sharing the good news of Jesus Christ is so important that we ought to set aside our theological differences so that we can support the work of sending the good news all over the world. And they joined with other Baptists all across America in doing this very thing. Until something happened that came to its culmination in the year 1860. It lasted for 5 years. Still going on in certain places. From 1860 to 1865, what was being fought in America? The Civil War. And among the things that were responsible for the Civil War was the issue of slavery, which all was driven by the economy. We understand that. that it was economically driven is unmistakable. Because guess where the southern farmer, planter, got the slaves? They bought them from the northern businessmen. It was all about economy. It was driving all of this. So in 1845, 55, these Baptists, they get together and they agree that we can set aside these differences for the sake of sharing the gospel until it was learned that there were some Baptist churches in the South who wanted to send a missionary to the mission field whose family owned some slaves. And when it was discovered that his family owned some slaves, the Northern Baptists said, we cannot go along with this. We think this is all wrong. And so the Southern Baptist Convention was formed, among whom? Southerners who rallied around the cause of the gospel, but who did not view slavery as the great evil that the Northern brothers and sisters perceived it to be. Have we since changed our mind as Baptists about that in the South? Well, apparently so, because the Southern Baptist Convention, at some of its recent conventions, actually gathered up documents and declared it was wrong not to have opposed slavery even back in its founding. That has not satisfied, however, many persons who are African Americans who were on the receiving end of the slavery issue back in the day. They say it's fine and well enough for you all to confess the sin. What else are you going to do? Calling for reparations, which means what? Payment in some capacity or another. Asking for millions of dollars from institutions, schools, and other places that have been responsible in part for not standing against this. So it's just an interesting part of our backstory here as, quote, Southern Baptists. So anyway, I've shown you the contrast between the styles of the church and the kind of preaching that was there. Lots of other stuff is happening in the middle part of all of this. This business of whether one should even send a missionary or not. If, as I said a moment ago, if Jesus died for whom? The whole world anyway? Why what? Why send a missionary? Or if he died for a few people anyway, why send a missionary if these matters have already been settled? So much so that when this particular man named William Carey, who ended up leading in the formation of the Baptist Missionary Society in England, when he actually declared that he wanted financial support to go to the continent of India to share the gospel, someone actually stood and shouted these words to him when he made the appeal. Young man, you are overly enthusiastic. If the Lord wants to save the heathen, he will do so without your help or mine. And he sat down. Fascinating, isn't it? These Baptists, I'll tell you, you better watch them. Who would want to join this bunch? I don't know. We are an interesting group of people. Anyway, other things are there in the middle of all of this. Convention gets organized. You have heard me tell the backstory here briefly about its founding, 1845, with this division between South and North, all happening, of course, in Augusta, Georgia, representing these 365,000 Baptists and the like. Now, to be fair, this business of slavery being the reason for the separation of Northern and Southern Baptists, or whatever, American Baptists, the Methodists in the South had already separated over the issue of slavery from their Methodist counterparts in the North. So it wasn't just unique to the Baptist thing. It was a cultural thing, obviously, depending on the particular location in the country where persons happened to be living at the time. And, of course, Southern Presbyterians ended up doing so shortly after the Baptists did. It's in our story, unfortunately. Well, that said, Are you surprised that there might be other things that might prompt Baptists to want to divide? You're right to think so. Because in the late 1880s and in the early part of the 20th century, early 1900s at least, 2000, into 2000, not 2000, in the 1900s, a particular movement called landmarkism. Have any of you ever heard that word, landmark Baptists? No? Well, what the landmark movement was about, and associated with a man named J.R. Graves from Vermont, no less, Baptist up there. He was petrified of the thought that Baptist churches might actually get together in a convention or an association. Interesting. Because he said the moment you join together with a convention or an association, somebody else is going to tell you what you have to believe. Did you get the idea? And he said, no way. He says the only way you can really be true to your personal beliefs is to remain independent and autonomous from any connection to a convention or an association in the least, particularly, he said, because of the baptism and church membership. And he said, and baptism and church membership really are all about what happens at the Lord's Supper. That's where his theology goes. So here's the question Graves asked. Who can rightly partake of the Lord's Supper? Who can? Who cannot eat the Lord's Supper? Well, just throw out here, just popcorn. I'm not going to say that you're wrong or right, but who gets to eat the Lord's Supper? Who? Okay, so those who are baptized, okay. Any other answers? Well, according to Graves, it's not good enough for you to say that you've been baptized. We had to have witnessed it ourselves. Right here in the church. Moreover, not only need we have witnessed it ourselves, we have to make sure that you've been living right. Because Paul said, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, some of you, Corinthians, have been what? Eating and drinking unworthily the body and blood of Christ, for which reason some are sick and some are dying. So Graves said, look, this thing is so holy and so sacred that there's no way I'm going to administer the Lord's Supper, he said, to anybody who I what? Don't have authority over as the pastor over the table of the Lord, because I don't want you to what? Eat this and be what? And be condemned. Now, I would venture to say that some of you in this place, perhaps the older generation, more so than the younger, have been in church before, where you've been cautioned. Don't you what? Don't you eat this unwittingly. Examine yourself, right? First. Make sure you're right with the Lord first. Have you heard that kind of language? Yes? No? Yeah, you've heard this one. Out of fear that what? You might do something that is hurtful to your person. So Graves said the only way we can protect this is to make sure what? You were baptized and you're right with God. So here comes the problem. So I moved from Shelby to Valdez. I want to join the church. Pastor Lell here, because he's a landmarkist, says, no, not until you what? Enter the waters of baptism, and I what? I baptized, but I've already been baptized. I plead with Pastor. I've been baptized. I already have been. I can tell you the time. I can tell you the place. They'll write a letter. But he'll say, I'm sorry. I wish I could, but brother, I love you too much. I don't what? I don't want you to do something that might harm you spiritually. So you're going to have to be baptized, what? Again, in this particular local church. Before you can become a member here. Well, that swept into America and into the Southern Baptist thinking or questioning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and nearly ripped up the convention. It ripped up a lot of churches. It tore up a lot of families. But it seems to have died something of a quiet death, although there are pockets in Kentucky, East Tennessee. I don't know of many in North Carolina, but there are pockets of landmark Baptists around. In fact, when I was, oh my goodness, it's 7:03. But you won't stay all night, but that was the big question when I was about to be ordained. The deacon body and the ministers in the area, they put the grill to me. They said, what are you going to do about this one? Because it was well known in certain parts of Mississippi. Being the smart aleck that I am, or that I was, I said, well, suppose the Ethiopian eunuch, Acts chapter 8, I've just been reading that book. I said, suppose the Ethiopian eunuch walks down the aisle of your church next Sunday and wants to become a member. Are you going to say, I wish I could, brother, but not until you're baptized here, because Philip's baptism of you in the desert doesn't work? They said, I guess you got a point, young man. They went on to the next question. But this is the point. This was a burning issue at certain times in the life of the Baptist story. That didn't end the controversy among Baptists, of course, but that was one of them. Oh, goodness. Division 2 came over the Bible, and a particular word associated with the Bible. You ready for the word? Inerrancy. Inerrancy. That is to say, when one reads the Bible, is it inerrant? Is it infallible? Now, these are two brand new words that only start showing up in Baptist history in the 1600s. Prior to this time, there was never any question as to whether what the Bible says is true or not. But now the qualifiers start getting thrown onto the Bible. What does it mean for the Bible to be true? And all kinds of questions began to be raised, none of which satisfied certain elements of the Baptist world at the time, Southern Baptists in particular. So they began to tease out what one must believe or cannot believe and still be considered good, faithful members of the Baptist Church, a Southern Baptist Church. And it typically ran along the lines of, do you or don't you believe that Genesis 1, 2, and 3, the stories of Adam and Eve, are these stories to be taken literally, or are these stories potentially able to be taken in some manner other than physically literal in the way that they are being described? And it morphed beyond that into, what does the Bible say about whether a man or a woman can be the pastor of a church? Taking portions of the Bible, the same thing applies toward deacons in the church. Is that only for men, or can that include women too? Do you or do you not ordain women in the church? All of this talk, these controversial issues, are tempered in certain sections and sectors of Baptists by a particular phrase called the soul's competency. Want to say that with me? Soul's competency. Which means what? Roger Williams, that Baptist that founded the First Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island, Smith and Helmies, they all declared one thing. We believe every individual stands with his or her soul before God, and each of our individual souls are competent enough to decide what we believe without somebody having to tell us what we should believe. So Baptists have argued along the lines of, do you or don't you embrace what it means to allow your brother or sister's soul to be competent? Or do you want somebody else to tell you what you can and cannot believe in order for you to be a Baptist? Now I fast forward to the latest issue that Baptists are addressing, the question of homosexuality. That's the loaded word today. Whether or not a person's sexual orientation and or lifestyle qualifies or disqualifies them from membership in a church or service as a minister. You see how these pieces all kind of fit together into the Baptist story. These are our stories. They are not unique to Baptists. The Methodists right now are, guess what? United Methodists they're splitting. I mean, it's done. They're splitting. They're just working out the particulars of what this looks like for them at this point. So these are the things that continue to rear their heads among the Christian family and among the Baptist family. They're not going away. Will there be other things that will replace these things? Yes. I will venture to say we will probably face some future divide over what we believe about the Lord's coming or not coming, second coming, in other words. Well, I think coming at some point. Well, I've run along long enough, and you've indulged me 10 minutes overtime, so wow, I better be quiet and let you ask me some questions that maybe I can answer. If not, Pastor Leo's got you. All right. So, sorry if I did that rather long, but I'm here to try to be helpful to you and to just provide you some framework for some of these things that we've talked more or less about it.
I will say that the last controversy you ran into, I am a deacon in this church, and I was brought up from a baby in this church, and I also attended my mother's home church in the mountains.
Right.
And at homecoming there, a former minister was quite sick, and he came forward and asked for prayer. And they asked all the ordained people to come up and pray with him and place their hands on him. I did not.
Because you knew.
And I don't know if I made the right decision. I felt that it was a sacred moment, and I didn't want to create a controversy. So I did not come up to pray.
Well, personally, I appreciate your prudence that way. And what is prudence? Prudence means what?
Well, I had to weigh what was
That's right.
the most appropriate thing.
Yeah, it means making a value judgment about whether what you're doing is truly going to be more beneficial than hurtful. And sometimes we abstain from certain things out of prudence. Now, it's sad, unfortunately, that that's the case. One would hope that progress would be made so that, because your prayers are equally as efficacious as anybody else's prayers would be in that moment. But yes, that's part of our Baptist story. And I know in my own upbringing that was a no-no. And I had many conversations with my superiors in faith in terms of, there being my mentors or whatever. And I said, well, my own position about that, you can only blame yourself for. They looked at me with some puzzlement. I said, because you taught me to read the Bible, learn from the Bible, cover to cover, and to cover, and to Mass. And I've dedicated my entire life to doing just that. And when I read the biblical text, I bring my arguments from the text to the conversation. Get your Bible, let's go. That usually slows it down a bit. Because there's a verse or two, to be sure, there's a verse or two that says this, that, or the other. And I had a specific conversation, just to follow this up and see how this turned out, with a friend of mine when I was serving at a church in Maryland in the D.C. area. He had come to be the pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And he had taken the church in a very conservative direction, clearly away from any women serving as deacons or any ministry capacity. And so again, I sat down for lunch together. And I said, there's not a lot of difference between us because we do take the Bible very seriously. And he said, yeah, but why are you ordaining women and deacons and this, that, and the other? So, well, first of all, I'm not doing any churches. But in the second place, it's quite biblical. And he said, now, when you look at the tradition of the church, you find this, that, and the other, and I said, yeah, Right. I said, as a matter of fact, you made my argument better for me than I could have made it myself. He looked at me and said, what? I said, you said this would be really an exceptional thing that would happen because you don't find it that frequently in the Bible. He said, you're exactly right. And guess what? You don't find many other women who give birth to a child who are virgins. Are you ready to throw that one out too, I asked him? He said, you kind of do read the Bible, don't you? I said, yes. I mean, yes, the Bible, yeah. Well, yeah. Now that one seems to have settled itself out in most places, seems to have. The Southern Baptists, of course, have clearly declared that that's just not what they embrace. And some fear that when you allow that sort of thing to happen, it will open the door for other things to happen too. It's the second major controversy that I think is ongoing right now. We don't have to work our way through as we do. Other question or observation about that? Have I done anything like you wanted to do?
Absolutely. But
You just told me to do some things. Okay.
Well, and I think, I don't know if anybody here may have read this, but I know you're familiar with First Baptist Decatur.
Mm-hmm.
That's the church in the news this week.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
First Baptist Decatur outside of Atlanta
Right.
was recently, they've been disassociated several times from
Mhm.
different groups.
Right, from the state convention
Right.
church, but the local association.
Local association.
Yeah.
So could you speak to how, as Baptists and autonomy, what autonomy means
Yes.
and how that goes with someone from the top, be it,
Yeah.
someone from the Southern Baptist Convention or anyone else telling us what to do?
Yeah, and you can almost go back to J.R. Graves, who said, look, autonomy means each church is self-determining about its beliefs and its practices. Each church is. And when each church is, and you're part of an association, now suddenly the association says, well, because we have a majority here that don't believe the same way you do, thank you very much, we're not what? We're not interested in your continued participation with us. That will happen. I think the association, quote, is within its right to do that, but I also think it's within the church's right to say, well, thank you very much for not letting us continue to participate with you, because we're not interested in participating with you anymore either way. Yeah.
One more question I thought maybe I could ask you to speak to is why schools like Gardner-Webb Community School exist.
Okay, excellent. Great question. There have historically been 6 Southern Baptist seminaries that prepare persons for ministry, and they are geographically located. The first one being Southern Seminary, which originated in Greenville, South Carolina, which means obviously you have a Charleston connection. Then it moved to Louisville, Kentucky a few years later, and then from there, there was a seminary started in Southwestern Seminary in Texas, and then another one in Southeastern here, and one Midwestern in Kansas City, and one on the West Coast called Golden Gate. So you have these 6, and New Orleans being one of the deep south. So you have these 6 seminaries. Well, when all of this Southern Baptist stuff and arguments over the Bible and heresy and the like began to stir up, it became pretty obvious to certain Baptists that any freedom that we have previously enjoyed was about to be called into question. So they said, we probably better have some other schools out there to prepare persons for ministry. My own school, the one at Gardner-Webb, started in 1992, about the time that Southern Baptists were fighting and could not seem to find their way out of the fight. And so the president of the university at the time said, we need a school. It was the first in North Carolina, followed by Campbell, who has a divinity school, and then by Wake Forest, that has a divinity school. Now, we are all different in terms of our outlook and our perspective. We're celebrating our autonomy. We're doing theological education in our own ways. Each one of us uniquely are. And there are other schools that are doing the same thing. Now, that said, there were so many of these other kind of Baptist schools beginning to pop up. You probably also have read in the news that the one at Hardin-Simmons University in West Texas, the Longsword Seminary, has just announced its closing. And Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond did. Unfortunately, what happened at the one in Richmond was they could not begin to agree as a faculty as to what their mission was in terms of being a seminary. And it led, unfortunately, to disagreements and arguments, Baptist men, with each other, to the point that the school lost its footing and lost its purpose. We at our school have tried to maintain a focus. Our focus is to prepare those whom God has called to ministry. With the emphasis on this, we don't call anybody to ministry. God does the calling, and we exist to prepare those whom God has called to whatever ministry it is they believe God has called them. We're not calling them to be the pastor or not the pastor. Guess who does that? The church does that. Local Baptist churches. So we exist to do just that. Now, some theological institutions are out to talk about the latest buzzword in theology. That's not what we're about. We're interested in the church, as we know. Yes, sir.
Comment on the priesthood of the believer.
A beautiful expression. Priesthood of believer. Other traditions would say you have priests who are somehow what? Elevated beyond and above others. Priesthood of believer is tied with the word soul competency. That is, every individual is himself or herself a priest themselves to God. And because every individual is, you don't require or need someone else to what? To vet you to say that what you believe is right or you believe is wrong. You open the Bible, you read the Bible, you come to conclude what you come to conclude. And Baptists have historically been okay with that, even when we disagree. As I said, you get two Baptists together, we're going to have three opinions because one of us cannot yet make up our mind about this. But as a priest, we're what? We're working through these things. Great question. Great word. Great expression.
Maybe speak to the ordination of Baptist ministers in contrast to other denominations.
Yeah, and that one is interesting too. Local congregations ordain their ministers in the Baptist tradition that is ours. And inasmuch as local churches do the ordaining, it means you are vetting this particular person for the ministry to which he or she might have been called. Other denominations will have a bishop or will have a hierarchical structure and will require of their persons being ordained to go through specific training and the like before they actually qualify for ordination. Now, for Baptists, that has its pluses and its minuses. In other words, in some places, unfortunately, they say, look, if you've got a pulse, we will ordain you. Unfortunately, there are some places, and that seems to be the case, because you might hear the sermon or you might hear the teaching and you go, you ordained that? Whoever that was, whatever we mean by that, we'll do that. But the other side of it is, guess what? As a Baptist, by golly, guess what? Every local church still may do that. And I will go toe-to-toe with some of my Baptist brothers and sisters in theological education that thinks there needs to be a tighter structure for who gets ordained. I'll say that become something other than a Baptist then. Because Baptist congregations exercising priesthood of believer and soul's competency have said, we decide who we will or who we will not ordain. Whether you like it or whether you don't, in the church across the street or down the road other places. So.
It really is a beautiful connection of history and things that we can just kind of shove off and deem so boring and it doesn't affect us, but really the history of a Baptist is a beautiful picture of what life looks like. Yeah. And how we're going to have to come to a place where we can take all our different views of what you read and what I read and what you read, and we've got to find some way to weave those together.
I think so too. In fact, before I left, I remember seeing my wife says, what are you going to talk about? And I said, she said, it's going to be boring. I said, are you kidding? I said, it will be exciting. She said, you do Bible study so well. Why would you want to go do that? I said, no. This is our story. This is organic. This is live. I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road.
We can see how this last thing we'll say, but we can see how easy it is to fall into that trap of just tell me what to believe.
Yeah.
Just tell me and I'll follow. Just tell me what to think and I'll be good. But really, as a church, encouraging people to think and to process.
You're right, Allison.
Person in that.
I mean, ideally, yeah, we have a benevolent dictator that loved us and told us everything we should do. That's the simplest life of all lives, as long as we like how things are going. But that's not been our way. We said, no, we can think. Priesthood believer, we can think on our own, give us our Bible, and let us go to work here. So then, of course, the question is, well, what does this Bible say, and how do you decide what this Bible says? Well, just listen to me, I'll tell you. So there you go again. And as we all know, somebody important told us once upon a time that this is what we ought to believe, and we believe it. So in our own theological seminary, I use this analogy, and I can close with this. We all go through life, and I liken life into carrying suitcases. And in our suitcases, guess what? All the stuff that's important to us. Everything we believe. And that stuff in that suitcase, somebody put in there. Some important person in our life story told us this, and what do? Put it in that suitcase. And when persons come to our school, this is what I challenge them with. I'll say, look, you've got some great suitcases. Things have been put in your suitcase throughout your life. Some important person told you this, some life experience taught you this, and you got it in the suitcase. While you're here, open the suitcase. Let's take a look at everything that's in the suitcase, so that when you leave here, you can say, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. Even if it's because somebody important said to me I should put this in the suitcase, fine. But at least own the fact that somebody told you this, and you put it in there because somebody else told you to put it in there. But somebody else once upon a time told you, there was such a thing as Santa Claus. I have to say it kind of under my breath, because it really is. You tracking with it? So we have to investigate these things and know why we believe what we believe. So that's part of what we try to do in our school. Yes, please.
Can I tell you why I like the Baptist church? I went to a non-denominational church, and the minister baptized me. So when I came to this church, they put it before the congregation if they'd accept me as a member. They asked me if the minister had been ordained, and I said no. But they accepted me anyway. He later became ordained after that. But that's why I love them. They accepted me.
Absolutely. And I usually say to people, oh, so it was the minister's baptism, was it? Not the Lord's, huh? Same way with the Lord's Supper. Oh, it's the pastor's table, not the Lord's. So I leave those matters to the Lord, and I'm glad this church left that matter to the Lord. Yeah. Well done. How many years ago was that? How long ago was that?
Oh, good. When I was 11, I was saved when I was 11.
Yes, ma'am.
I know in my soul I was saved.
Yes, ma'am.
God was with me.
Wow.
I was about 21.
So about 2 weeks ago, she beautiful story. Yeah. Something else on the question? Anything? Observation?
Well, thank you, Dr. Canoy, and thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I'll end with this, and you've done a wonderful job teaching us, and Allison brought this out, how messy our history really is. Right? And there's an elder statesman in North Carolina Baptist life named Jack Causey. You know Jack? Jack was pastor at First Baptist Statesville, did some work at CBF in North Carolina. And he said, over lunch one day, he said, you know, the way we do church is messy. And he said, the way we do life is messy. That's bad. He said, the way we do church is messy. And it fears life, much like what you said, Allison. But what we allow to happen in our group of Baptists, and I'm speaking for First Baptist, I'm speaking for as a student in a doctoral program at the School of Divinity at Gardner-Webb, and many other schools in the country and around the world. Baptists do really well when we teach you how to think, instead of teaching you what to think. And Christians, we are given a mind. As people, we're given a mind and expected, I believe, to use it. And this brand of Baptist church allows us to do that. And that's why I'm thankful to serve here, and I'm thankful for those who have set the standard high in that regard here in our history. Many of you know it's been since 1981 that this church has called someone who was a terminal graduate of one of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. That's unique in this area. So you have that in and of itself, to be uniquely Baptist at First Baptist in that way. Because we do allow diversity not only in thought and conviction on the things that may be a little negotiable, but we also allow freedom for those convictions that people do hold to dictate how we live our lives as people of faith. So thank you, Dr. Canoy. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to close this in prayer. And then if you'd like to speak to Dr. Canoy, I know he would probably be welcome to speak with you afterwards. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the diversity that you give us in the expressions of faith that you have led us to walk in. And we pray that as we go forth from here, we would take what we've learned, maybe for the first time, and claim it as part of our own story. And we pray that you would continue to mold and shape our minds and our hearts so that we may look less like us and more like you. It's in Christ's name I pray. Amen.